The following presentation is a gift from the team at Streamline Publishing, publishers of Fine Art Connoisseur, Plein Air Magazine, and weekly newsletters Fine Art Today, Realism Today, Plein Air Today, and American Watercolor, and events the Plein Air Convention and the Figurative Art Convention. We offer over 400 different art instruction tutorials and ultra high-quality video by the world's leading artists. If you like what you see, help us support our artists and our team with your purchase. Each video airs.
And I thought I might talk to you a little bit about how I might get back into a painting after I've taken a break, and what I might do to the painting, you know, just to make sure that it sort of comes back to the color that I left it. It's been it's been a night, and I'm now back in the morning, and what's happened is some of the dark of the painting has sort of oiled out slightly, meaning some of the oil in the paint has gone into the ground. Not as much as if it was a acrylic gesso, but some of it has. And when that happens, the darks tend to kind of look a little more matte, a little lighter, which makes the whole value structure of what I left it as different. So what I did is I gave it a very light coat, and the emphasis here is light coat of Retouch varnish. And in this case, it's an aerosol-based Retouch varnish that goes on. It kind of brings some of, not all, but some of the gloss and value back, and some of the saturation back in those dark areas. The colors that generally tend to sink most are going to be earth colors, and I don't have a lot of those on my palette here, but I do have, and I have been painting a little bit with the ochre yellow and the the ivory black. Those are the two that generally will sink. So if you find that when you're painting your darks and that's happening, you can do two things. You can actually put some oil into the mix as you're painting, and that means there's more oil there that then can be sinking into the ground, but still more left on top. Or you can do what I did, which is hit it with a very light touch of Retouch varnish. You want it to be light, by the way, because you don't want to isolate. You don't want to build like a wedding cake of layers. You want to try to avoid doing that, especially if you're going to work as thick as I am on a flexible support. That will, if you do put thick varnish layers in between each session, it makes the paint film less stable, and it's more prone to things like chipping, cracking, or flaking, if you're worried about that sort of thing. Anyway, to move on, I've had a chance to kind of think about what I'm doing here and see what kind of changes I want to make now. Because if I make the changes now, then the changes will be more integrated when we do the final finished top work. And so I would say at this point I'm moving on from the underpainting. I'm still redrawing into, I'm still working on my composition and my scale and my sizes of shapes and things, but I'm moving away from it just being a wash. I'm going to be moving towards where you'll see the connection to this to the finish. So that said, I'm going to be stepping in and out as I gauge and judge some of my shapes, scales, and relationships. And I'm going to actually again go back to making a few tick marks. I can see some things I need to change already. And again, think of these as like landmarks. You know, they're not meant to be anything other than, oh, that fan needs to be bigger, lower there, the shape of that needs to change. You're going to see me scrape. Let's talk about scraping. Scraping is actually a very valuable part of painting, especially when you're painting this thickly. I spent 20 plus years thinking that Sargent, again this is about Sorolla, not Sargent, but I spent 20 years thinking that Sargent was just this incredibly amazing draftsperson who got it right every time. Every time he touched the canvas, it was what it was supposed to be. And it wasn't until probably 20 years later, as I keep saying, I learned that he scraped as much as he painted, which really relieved me of this pressure of trying to be that good. I'll never be that good, but at least I know I can scrape. So there's areas where I'm going to take the paint off and move things around. And the reason I scrape is because if I do that, I get that paint out of the way, then I can put more paint on, and you probably won't know, well, you will since you're watching, but if you saw this in its finished state, you wouldn't know where I changed something. To me, that's the value of scraping. And so, for example, I'm going to just arbitrarily take this part off because I want to move the back of her rebozo, just as I'm going to want to move the front here. Now, when you see me scraping, I'm going to put these down. When you see me scraping, I'm not doing it willy-nilly. I'm not doing it randomly. In the sense, I'm actually thinking about how I want that gesture of the scrape to be. Because just like in a brush, that gesture, that movement of the paint actually becomes part of the surface quality. And you'll note that when I scrape, I'm going to take off what's on the knife. I don't want to scrape with a purple knife in, say, a light area, just as I wouldn't want purple in my paint brush when I'm working the area of the fan that's in the warm light. In this case, I might pull it this way. I might pull that way. And all this is doing, again, is just taking some of the impasto work, which is something I'm going to move around a little bit, off the surface. Some of it I leave on because it's going to set and I'll strike over it. But just from experience, there's sometimes I want to take a highlight or a bump off. Now, some people are reluctant to scrape because they think they lose ground. I want to tell you straight up, you don't lose ground, you gain a chance to fix something in a way that still looks fresh. I think every time I've touched the canvas, I've pulled this knife in a different way, in a different direction. I'm sort of jumping around here, but let's talk about this as well, because it has to do with the scraping. In general, not always, but in general, if you're working from thin to thick, from the back of the picture plane to the front, thin to thick, it helps sort of reinforce this idea that everything in the foreground, which is painted a little more thickly or a lot more thickly, is closer to us. If you want to paint the painting that way. That's a very classic way of painting. Along with dark to light, thin to thick, transparent to opaque. That doesn't always have to be the rule, but in many cases, it works well. And you can use that thin to thick, distant to foreground, in conjunction to other things. Like I mentioned warm to cool, cool to warm yesterday about distance. You can align that with small shapes to big shapes, all sorts of things. When you start putting these sort of contrasting ideas together in different combinations. Also, less edges, softer, more refined edges. If you combine, let's say, thin with thick, diffused with sharp, that's taking two different contrasts, putting them together to create the illusion of depth into the picture plane. When I scrape, I'm taking off some of the build that I had built up yesterday with the brush strokes. The other thing that's nice is, and again, I'm going to talk a little bit about how lead white works compared to, say, titanium, is you can see a lot of expressive brush works here. Let's say I want to fill the grain in this canvas. Well, the lead white, because of the way it moves and the way it drops and the way it sticks, allows me to kind of come across the surface like that, and I can knock off the depth. I'm not lifting any of the paint. I'm just basically sort of flattening the mountain or the little bump of the stroke, and it gives me a flat surface, which is a different quality to the impasto work that I'll be doing in this area and in the figure. So again, I'm looking for a contrast. In that case, flat versus bumpy, stroke gesture versus sort of just patches. So I'm not lifting paint in this situation here. Like here, if you can zoom in here, there's a lot of dimensional bump going on with those pulls. I think that that is actually going to compete with what I'm going to end up doing over here. So not taking it off so much as I am just striking the top. So I still have a sense of paint and texture there, but it's now flattened. And I can see that happening here a bit too. Now I may and probably will come back and put some more of the strokes in there, but right now I just want it out of the way so that it doesn't compete with the textural elements I will introduce here. And I can see other places where I do that. In the work that I see Sorolla do, mostly, not always, but mostly, he's either very thick consistently everywhere, or he's very selective about where he builds up his paint. So he might not, and I'm going to avoid that, I think, in this painting. I'm going to avoid getting too thick over here so that most of my thick paint happens over here. But that doesn't mean I'm going to jump from thin to thick. There will be passages that sort of transition, not just in color and value, but actual dimension of the paint. Thinner in this peripheral area, thicker, more bumpy in this area here. It's that transition, that ease from one to the other that I want to manipulate as I paint. I'm actually going to knife some of this area in the light down too. Yesterday it felt good to kind of put in these bumps, these impasto work, but I think it's going to get in the way of work I do later today. So again, notice how I'm pulling. I'm pulling the fan in that direction, I'm pulling the fan in that direction because I know that I'm going to be playing the radial quality of the little leaves of the fan off. This sort of thing doesn't bother me at this point. In fact, when some of that builds up, I may leave it because it might just add some visual interest to the edges. But right now, I'm still thinking in terms of shape, and I'm just trying to, I don't know, just trying to loosen the painting up so that I'm not having to, I don't want to focus in on what I've already done. I want to find the new things I need to work on. I also think that in retrospect, I may knock some of that cool down, meaning make it less blue. We'll see, we'll see. But for now, let's go back to, I'm stepping back to look at my proportions, my shapes, and make corrections. And today, I think I'm going to start in this area, kind of to develop this part a little more. I want this to be a little further along than the rest of the painting as this thing continues. For those who are sensitive or have become sensitized to, let's say, solvents, and this is odorless mineral spirits, it's probably the easiest, safest to have around in your studio. It's not enough to cap this if you're sensitive, because if you're painting with it on a large canvas or even a small one, and you cap this, you've still got the solvent coming off of this surface. So you can tell yourself you're putting less into the studio air by putting the top on, but the fact of the matter, the surface area of this canvas far outweighs the surface area of these open containers. So as you paint, you really, if you're concerned about solvents, and some of you should be, you need to get ventilation. You need to get flow going into your studio and out the window, essentially. So don't think that just putting caps on solves your problem. Now, as I do this, I've stepped back to where I can see the whole painting, and I'm looking at not just the positive shape of the woman, I'm looking at the negative shape between, say, the back of the woman and the left edge of the canvas, and I'm looking at the negative shape of the fan versus her right hip. I'm looking at sort of around my subject, not just at my subject. And I can see that there are some pretty important things I want to change. I'm going to use a fairly neutral, slightly warm tick mark. Now these tick marks will not survive the painting. They will go away. Actually, I'm lying. I'm just going to go ahead and use some of what I would consider close to my colors I want, colors and values in the final. So this fan is a little more fanned out. I don't want to outline. The point here is I don't want to outline. I just want to convey where the fan contrasts with the ground, and that's starting to look a little better. And also I can see in my figure here that her forearm, which is under the rebozo, or the large scarf. Actually comes out more out here. Now there's not a lot of value difference that I just put in there because I'm painting the light of the rebozo. So that tells me, since I'm here, that tells me I want to take the fan and put a little more dark. I'm not going to be too concerned about my poles yet. I will later when I start doing my top work. But that does create a much more interesting shape to me, and having this circular movement, and I'm going to square that off a little bit more because of the shape that it is. So but having this echo that, or this echo that, becomes the sort of thing I look for at this point. What can I do to accentuate a repeated form, but not in such a way that it's too similar? I spoke about that in our first session, about looking for the repeating forms in the seaweed, strokes of the serape and the dress and the movement of the rocks, but now I'm also looking for repeating shapes. One thing I should comment on is that with lead, this has been 12 hours, and I'm not using any oils or mediums yet, if at all. This paint has set. I'm able to do these really interesting textural drags, even though this is wet. This is wet. That's wet. There's a grab, there's a stick that allows me to kind of pull this paint on top like it's almost like it's dry on dry. And that's another thing I like about the lead white, is that it does that. It allows me to kind of sort of accelerate this layering and dry brush drag. If I were to be painting with like linseed oil, which I do, that would slow down things and it would give me a different kind of drag. And of course, if I were painting with an alkyd, a dryer, that surface would be dry by now and it'd be a whole different game. So try the different mediums and take note of what you see them do. Now I squared that off because it's more square in her arm, and also even though this echoed that, I wanted there to be just a little bit of difference there. Just a little. It's those, in my opinion, it's those small touches that really count. And we're going to suggest at the bottom of the fan there that it is starting to go into some sort of shadow or cast a shadow upon itself, and that here there's a little more light coming around. Now I will also be cutting this edge later with the beach to make it a more interesting shape, but I'm looking for variety. I want variety, variety, variety. If only because let's say I'm wrong with some part of the painting, if it just looks different, that could generate enough interest so that it doesn't look wrong. I don't know how to explain it beyond that. But let's take a look here now at the corner or the elbow. Now this is all underneath the rebozo here, but I see that I need to take this here over more. And what's interesting is there's a bit of a warmth, almost a sort of a coarse shadow warmth that's being camouflaged by the pattern, which will go on later. So on this side, which is the warm side, there's warm, and on this side, the cool side, it's cool. And when I get the pattern of the black stitching going, it's going to look quite nice. So that's one change that made a big difference, in my opinion. It sort of projects her arm out further in front of her right hip, which then makes the back left hip sort of step back. I'm going to exaggerate something here. Let's see. when I say exaggerate, I mean it's there, but I'm going to, how shall I put it? I'm going to sort of make it a little more amplified than it is. And that is, I'm going to have her come in like that. I don't want this to be square to the, or perpendicular to the picture plane. I want to start looking at angles that are not quite square. This is horizontal, this is vertical, this is not vertical. When you introduce horizontal and verticals in your painting, there should be a reason. And that's because you want to make that area static compositionally. If you want to kind of convey a sense of motion, then you really want to paint off the perpendicular or off the horizontal in general. Now there was this little bit here, repeat, that I loved, but it's actually darker than the beach. It's warmer and darker than the beach behind. And this may or may not stay in the entire painting. I'm just putting it down because it's here. It may go away. We'll see. There's sort of a bit of it showing there as well. Let's go back to checking my tick marks and sort of checking my proportions. I step back and I'm looking, and I know that at the back of the head I'm going to have to come back to at some point. Let's jump into the face a little bit. So, for the most part, I've been keeping things very simple, very blocky. I'm not going to paint the face refined here, but I'm going to start to show some of the turning of the form and some of the color changes that happen within the shadows. Most of the face will fall into the warm camp in the sense that even the shadows are actually kind of warmed up here. There's this bounce that we talked about yesterday about how the light's coming up. It's actually flowing into this part of her cheek and jawline. It's hitting underneath, but it's up here. So this area is warmer than up here, which is why you see me made that change. Let's look at the part of her face, her cheekbone and eye socket that's in the light. Again, it's light, and for the most part, warmer than the shadows, as warm as some of the shadows are. Now I think what I'm going to do is paint the value of the light shape down a little bit and then pull it up as it develops. Now that's pretty warm. That's warmer than I want. I'm going to take it a little more. It's going to still stay warm. I'm going to take it a little less warm. And what I'm doing here is just mixing something that is going to be in between. And once I find it, I will be trying to do variations of it. Like right about there, I think. Same value, a little pinker. So this has a lot more yellow. This has a little more pink quality, which is red, essentially. But there's some yellow in that. And then I have this warmer part here. That seems a little more appropriate. Now in this part of the painting, I might choke up on it. And I'm not going to sit there and try to draw lips right away. I'm going to be thinking of the face, the construction of the face. Okay. And, you know, you can think about that, the nose, the bridge of the nose. As it comes down, this is facing the sun. This part of the nose is facing the sun. It's actually tipped up a little towards the sky. So it's not going to be the same here as it's going to be, say, in between her eyes. I think we're going to see that the light that hits the brow between her eyes is a little lighter, a little warmer. Now these are rough. I'll be cutting around and shaping these bits and pieces of paint. There is this eye socket that has some warmth to it. And then there's her eyelids, which is combined with her eyelashes. Now, the photo doesn't give me all that information. So there's a point where the actual eyelids sort of merge with her eyelashes as one shape. If I hit the value and I hit the shape, I don't really need to actually paint them as individual things. So that would be her eye. And at this point, also her eyelash. Okay, so now we continue just looking for the shapes in the face. And she has quite a lovely chin, softer edge. There. We see the cheekbone around her eye socket wrapping up. It cools down as it wraps up. Now this is where it gets a little tricky because there's a passage from warm to cool along this cheekbone. I think I'll start with the cool there and come back with the warm. So I'm cleaning my brush. I don't want that pink to be in my brush when I'm trying to do the warm light. I don't want that cool color. Let's see. If we do that, there's a little piece of bone above her brow here that softens. Like that. Now you can see I'm leaving this mark to stand in for her eyebrow. And that's the plan right now. I may or may not hit that harder or softer. And there is a bit of a highlight on the nose. Now I'm not doing the highlight, but there's a point like on the nose where this part of the cheekbone and this part of the nose is facing the same light. And that's not the shape I wanted, but it's close enough for now. Because I can come in and cut around it as needed. So all I'm doing here, even though I'm saying eye socket, nose, tip, cheekbone, I'm really just looking at the shapes and not trying to think about the anatomy per se. I'm more of an observational painter than I am somebody who depends on my anatomical knowledge. Okay. And when we get to, let's just keep painting. It's likely that I'm going to sort of build the face, lose the face, build the face. I might even scrape the face as we continue to paint. I'm just trying to get a sense of where the attention is going to end up, where I want that to end up in this painting. We have this huge 30 by 40 inch painting, huge by our standards. But this will be the point that it's small. That's a contrast in its own right. It's like this is big, this is small. So now how do I get from this big shape to this small shape? That's the beauty moment. That's what I'm going to be trying to work out and trying to connect and trying to transition throughout the rest of the painting. Now that was not dark enough. That was supposed to be kind of a coolish passage in the shadow, like a cool highlight. The problem is that it was too light, that it sort of associates with this and not the side of her face. There. Now we start to see the shape of the eye socket. And you note that I'm trying not to pull out the little tiny, tiny, tiny brushes. I may get to that point at some point, but I want to see if I can't use this larger brush to kind of chisel out and sort of carve the planes of her face. Now, something I know that's going to help is let's get that neck. You know, you probably wouldn't have thought this is important right now, but I think it is. We need to explain the bounce underneath her chin, underneath her jaw. And to do that means I need to put that little bit of light that's on her neck, because that tells you where the bounce is coming from. Like that. When I put that mark in, this all starts to make more sense. So we're now going from this light to this light shape down to this light shape, which then gets picked up here, 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 here. So we have a sense of side light. Not to forget, we're going to have a side light kind of coming in here that explains. This is what I call unifying the painting through the light. We're using warm lights, cools, darks. We're using directionality of the light, so light shapes, dark shapes. We're coordinating or sort of making the planes of the objects break and group. This is one group. This is another group. This is one group. This is another group. And when we do that, we start to build this sort of movement throughout the painting with the eye. And I haven't talked about it much, but this is how I'm getting your eye to move in a direction that I want you to move. Everything else from this point on starts to become more about how subtle do I want to make these passages or movements to be. And that's really a call that you make in your own work. A lot of people want to make it very subtle and very sort of like hide the fact that this is paint. There are those who really want to make sure that this is very, very clearly paint and keep things simple. But from here on out, that's pretty much it. This is still bothering me. I think for now what I can do is leave that there but sort of take down the value, because the value of that, the lightness of that is so close to that that they seem like they're on the same part of the picture plane. So all I'm going to do here is I'm going to change the hue to a little warmer, quite a bit warmer apparently. Let's back off that. And I'm going to make sure that the value of that orangey red that I put there, and perhaps even the intensity, is less and lower value. And then it should start to feel like it's stepping back. Its position's still problematical. It's still kind of a tangent, which I'll get to at some point. But I just want to push it back. I still like the idea that there's going to be a little bit of streak of light close to her. Yeah, not dark enough. And let's make it a little more tertiary. Okay. Okay, let's try that. Yeah, still not. I think I need to take that off. The paint that's there is still a bit in the way. Even doing that helped push it back. So I'm putting a little purple into this orangey just to kind of brown it out more. Cools it and browns it out, and that's enough for now. Actually, I think since that is a critical area, I'm going to draw in or cut in some edges that clarify what's going on there. Let's see. Take some of my, this is kind of a cool gray that I made from the pile yesterday, a warm gray. I'll start subdividing with more distinctions of red, green, blues in the grays. Let's see, is that about right? Yeah, let's just. Now I can take an opportunity now to cut a little bit, but I don't want to get too caught up in edges. I just want to, again, clean up. And that's a good, I wouldn't want to go much further than that right now. Maybe I want to indicate where the lips are and the shape. Now note that we have concave, convex going on. Those counters, those sort of opposites are important, especially when you get to edges or silhouette of things. a lot of what Sorolla did was push paint into paint, and we're not quite there yet. I'm still sort of blocking out some of the shapes, but there'll be a point where I'm going to start to take one color on one side of an edge, push it into the other, and take the color on the other side and push it back. And that will create some transitions through the drag of the brush and sort of intermixing of the paint that sort of, it's not quite the same thing as taking two colors and brushing. It's a little more interesting than that. But I'm sort of thinking about that as we go. I do want to knock down one edge though, and let's talk about that. Right here, we have a very strong contrast between the back of her head, or her temple, and her forehead. It's actually stronger than it should be. When I look at the reference, that's a softer transition. Transitions are either very abrupt, meaning there's an edge, they're not so abrupt, which means there's a bit of a transition, or there's a slow transition, which is like a gradation. So look at your edges that way. Is it abrupt, meaning is there actually an edge you see? Is there something that's a quick transition? It's not an edge, but it happens quickly. Is it something that happens slowly across a painting? Just thinking in those three terms will sort of bring a wider variety to your passages when you go from one shape to another. Should it be abrupt here? Or should it be sort of loose and less abrupt? Should it be abrupt here? Ask yourself. I think at some point I'm going to probably make this less abrupt here because that edge right now isn't supported by anything else in this area. And I think that it's always going to compete with the edges I put in here. And by that, I mean, I don't want you to be sort of misdirected over here. I want you to think that, oh yeah, that's the water that's running down that part of the beach here, but I don't want you to be aware of that more than the glow and the intensity that I'm trying to build here. All right? We'll talk more about that later as we get further along. Let's look at the back of the head. Now, yeah, the head's bigger. I'm going to draw on the shape a little more, which means probably pulling this flower out further, and then we're going to get into some fun stuff, some details, but not too early. But I want to talk to you about this highlight. See, we have sunlight coming in here, warm light, and it's hitting this part of her head right here. The top of her head is exactly what is happening over here. So this is a highlight, let's say, of the top of her head, a light on top of her head, but it's the wrong temperature. This is as if the sun was coming down. So this will need to be warm, and this will need to be cool, and then you'll start to see the whole head round out because I've turned or changed the temperature of the light on top of her head. In fact, I could probably do it fairly simply after I put a little more back cranium in her. And I want to keep this fairly close to the background. We'll talk about why later. Keep that on the cooler side. It's not, I just put a straight black down and realized I don't want that. I almost never put a straight black down. So Roy would use straight black at times. You can see it in the work. I don't. So the idea here is, in that case I fed some alizarin. I don't think that was the best choice because we have cool down, sort of a purple. And you don't have to be exact, you just have to be close enough that, you know, people accept it. And I'm actually going to let this sort of disappear, certainly for now, into that background. I may never try to clarify the back of her head, because if I do, then you are sort of drawn away from this part. There's a decision that I make as a painter, and that you should make as a painter as well. Now let's go back to that highlight. Let's see, on the rocks, it was a cool top highlight. Let's do the same on the head. And again, that highlight, that cool thing, can't be as light value as in this because it's reflected light. There's less light hitting the top of her head. Even though I see it, it's not as light as in the area of light. So, if I maintain that thinking, and again, this is just simple shapes. So, by putting this cool light on top of her head, it makes us, it's part of the light shape, but it's reflected light. This is the warm light coming in at the side, the direct sunlight. This is the top cool light coming in from the sky. It only makes sense because you see it appear elsewhere on rocks and beaches that are turning in the same direction that the top of her head is turning. See, if I just done this with light and dark value, it would have worked in a classical sense. It would have worked, but I wouldn't be telling you about the temperature of the light that's coming from this direction versus the temperature of the light that's coming in from this direction. Warm this way, cool this way. And that's the fun of this. Now, do I want to get rid of that little calcy thing? Yeah, I'll ease it right now. But sometimes things like that, you just kind of want to play and leave. And again, this will be still an issue for me to fight and change. I'm not going to fix it now because I want to work elsewhere. I also want to soften her forehead. That break I told you here on her temple, I want to soften that, meaning the transition that isn't an edge, but isn't a fade or a gradation. It's just more of a quick shift. And again, I can do it by mixing. When I look at my source, it's actually a little darker. It's like a core shadow there. It's showing the skull, the actual bone, the way it turns. And so it is darker and warmer. It's just not quite that dark. So let's ease that a bit. A little more. And now, that is not the shape I wanted, and here's why. I'm going to be fixing this. This part of her face, her front temple, her nose, her cheekbones, really is pointed towards the sky. This is all about planes. I'm not sort of, it's pointed towards the sun. The sun's very low on the horizon at this point, just above it. So they're facing that plane. Note that her skull is doing this. As it's turning to the light, it's getting less of the sunlight and it's becoming a little darker and it's becoming a little cool. So up here, to really make this round out as it turns towards the top of her skull, I need to take that highlight down a little bit in value and shift it again towards the blue. But it's not going to go blue. Again, as we've been thinking, if this is where we were in the sunlight with lots of white added, and that's an approximation, it's actually maybe a little more like here. And if in the top of her head we're over here with the highlight, this is that, this is in this area here. To get from here to here means I'm going to be somewhere in here. That is the hue that I'm looking for. It isn't much more complex than that, to be honest. So I'm going to just take and put a color that's between this and that and a little darker there, and what you're going to see is the whole thing knits together and rounds out. There's this movement happening with the skull, and then dimensionally there's this movement as it turns away from us. So let's just start with, I don't know, I'm going to go on the cooler side, I think. And let's go a little lighter. Yeah, it's not bad. And I'm trying to pull, in this case, I want it to stay pretty much on the warm, intense side, so I'm trying to pull from my warm white pile. And I'm just going to soften that. Like that. Now the drawing's a little off, and actually the hair itself is a little contrasty there, so we're going to take care of that. All I'm doing now is just sort of, this goes from the lightest light, warmest, to still kind of warm but heading towards the cool. I'm going to actually soften that part of her hair there. And I'm going to do that by reducing the contrast and maybe even warming up that black transition. These are little tiny touches, but they're important because they bridge, and that's the key word here. They bridge from one color to another color. And you see this when you look. I'm not just thinking this out, I'm actually seeing this when you look. Let's see if I'm close enough on this. What do you think? Did that pull it together? Yeah. Now this is a bit harsh right now, like I've got her hairline up kind of a little back pastor's skull. That's a drawing issue, which we'll correct as we go. And again, I'm going to have to deal with that tangent of the rock behind her. I think right now I am going to just take it out, and we'll maybe revisit putting it back in later. Because really it would be right about here. And by taking out some of the dark in that area, basically I made this a little more gray, a little lighter in value. We start to see this shape a little more. And now you can start to see the profile. Still, it's a little too abrupt, in my opinion. But let's get a little more expressive with the paint. And we'll be cleaning that up more as we go. Since I moved the head, the back of the cranium, I'm going to actually take that the flowers, and be a little more expressive with it. Maybe make them a little larger in scale. In fact, oh, you know what? I'm going to move them, essentially. So let me do that first. I'm going to move them not by moving the flowers, but by cutting into around the flowers. This is what I would call opening up. Opening up meaning I'm not trying to get tight here. I'm trying to just like make a move and make a new shape and not worry about the mess I might be making, because I can come back and recover and tighten up the mess as much as I want. So I'm like, it's as if it's a drawing term, like you have gestures and then you kind of work longer and you kind of develop the form more, and then, oh, you need to move an elbow, move an arm, move a leg, move a rock, move a tree, because it's not where it's supposed to be or not the right size. So you just jump in and you don't worry about whether that part of the drawing matches yet the rest of the drawing. You just make the change. That's what I mean by opening up. So let's now move the left side of that flower over. And again, remember that's the left side of that flower is in the cool. And let's just bring it out. I like it having it overlap slightly. And let's look at the pink part of that flower, that of the rose above. And it is a pink. And I'm not worried about getting it exactly as intense as it is. I'm just not. It will look fine when I get everything else going. But I need to make sure that it's dark enough that it associates with the rose. Okay, and that tells me that I'm going to change some of the inside of that flower to a lighter. I'm not doing any of the accent shadows. I want to hold on to this warmth because that's the side of the rose, and I'm going to put a little of that warmth in here. Not going to worry about the accent shadows inside the flowers yet. That's like getting down to a level I don't want to go to yet, because I'm wasting time. If I have to move it more, and I have to move those accent shadows, I've wasted the time I've put into it. But I do want to at least indicate the light source, what's in the light on the flower and what's not. So, and let's be expressive. I can always knife this off if it's too much. But look, when I did that, again, this is the side facing the sun. This is the side facing the sun. This is facing the skylight, 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 skylight. Sunshine, skylight. All of that starts becoming more consistent. Now, I don't think I'm going to go any further with the head at this point, because I want to start addressing other areas in the painting, but I will come back to that on and off as I start to refine other parts of the painting. Okay, I've had a couple minutes to look at this from a distance, and I think what I'm going to do is pick this area, sort of reestablish some of my lightest lights and some of my smaller shapes. Just as I've done here, I want to sort of indicate some of the smaller shapes. I might even get into the pattern that we've been talking about a bit. But the reason why is that I'm now starting to think about not just light and dark and big shapes. I'm thinking about the small shapes, which are these sort of things. And if I put some of those in here, then that'll tell me out here, outside of the figure, I can start to introduce some of the small shapes, and then I can migrate from those smaller shapes to just bigger, more generalized shapes out here. It's almost like sort of figuring out where the finishing line is first before I run the race, although this isn't necessarily going to be how it finishes. So let's just re-examine some of the lightest lights describing the folds of her serape, rebozo scarf. And because paint is limited, I'm actually probably going to have to go a little cool with some of the lightest lights. And I have ways to recover. If you put a white down and it's too cool, you can actually embed some yellow on top of that and sort of striate it, and you end up with something that looks like it's lighter than it really is. First, let's get more paint, more white down on the surface. All right, there's my brush. So what I wanted is I want to start with the whitest white I can get and then sort of knock it down from there. And these are like tiny points. You know, it's like just a little yellow at this point, not a lot. And it makes all the difference in the world if you're keeping your whites clean, meaning in this case they're all warm versus, you know, sometimes warm, sometimes cool, sort of erratically. So let's see how we're doing here. Now there's points where these folds turn more to the light, like right there, it's catching more of the light. Now it does go cool. There's no way to fight that at this point. I will probably have a chance to insert some warmer yellows on top, floated on top. But right now I want to see how that little 3% break is. And now when I step back and I look at that, I start to see some variation happening in the lights, so that the light shape is not just flat, but there's some variation between light and dark, cool and warm. And there's definitely a strong one right here. All right, now I don't want to use the same white everywhere, or at least I want to try not to, I should say. I know that I'm painting into a bed of paint, so I will get some variation just because there's paint underneath that's now coming into play, but I'm also picking out of different parts of the pile, I should say. And I want a little break. See that there's a drag right there where the stroke here is thicker, not thicker, but there's a smoother transition. Here I want that little broken drag here, A for variation and B because it sort of describes the texture of the cloth. Having that against that, a more sort of bodied stroke, this more dry drag, just kind of generates interest and represents something without having to paint a lot of detail, especially when you step back. Something I haven't mentioned is that I tend to paint my paintings so that you look at them from about 6 feet, 5 feet away. And that's because when you step back like that, the effects that I'm trying to achieve here with the surface sort of blend and meld into something more than, you know, if you go like this, you can see every mark I've made. And I invite you to do that. But I really want you to also come back here and see how everything comes together. Blows apart, comes together. To me, that's the magic of what I'm trying to do. So let's put a little more variation in the fan here. Now, when I say variation, I'm not after detail as most people think of it. I'm thinking of variation, which means when I look at the fan, in general, there's a little more warmth and light up here, a little less down here. It gets a little more pinker in certain areas. And then there'll be points where on top of that, I strike maybe individual fan blades, and I want to suggest it. I don't want to sit there and render out everything. I just want to suggest it. And maybe the leading edge might be a little crisper here and less crisp here. Again, variation. Always variation. So to pull this off, let's go ahead and I'm going to start putting some of the pinker passages down here. Now that doesn't mean that it's darker in value, it just means it shifts in hue. There is an entire school of painting, American painters, come out of the Charles Hawthorne, Henry Henshey school, where they preferred to make a shift in hue before they shifted things in value. And they found that to be more of a beautiful way of handling form. It may or may not be your thing, but check it out, think about it. That's what I'm going to be playing here. Is that I want there to be more of a shift in hue than a shift in value in this fan. Okay, so let's put more pinks down here, out to the edge. I want to let some of that oranger, yellower color show through, I think. Because again, the idea here is to make some color effects happen below your threshold to actually distinguish them when you step back. So by the fact that this is the same value as what's around it, changes this part of the brush, the fan, I should say. Let's go a little pinker there. Now let's talk about a little bit about edges. You know, again, Sorolla was not interested in edges too much unless he was doing a very refined painting. His beach paintings, you know, he basically painted very rapidly and got the edges and kept them. He didn't really, I don't see him paying a lot of sort of concerted attention to the edges. But in this case, I think I do want to knock down some edges, because if I want this part to project out, maybe if I make that a little softer, it's going to look like it's behind. Okay, let's get rid of these outlines here. Now, let's go a little darker with that. Okay. And if I really, at some point I will come in and I'll start varying the, I might do it now, a little bit. I might sort of indicate that there is fan edges or change. But I don't want to get too far into that yet. I want to keep this gestural. Why don't we jump in a little bit to the pattern that happens here? I mean, we're going to do that now. Because when I introduce the pattern there, it's going to make it difficult to paint, let's say, the form on the arm, on the cloth, because the pattern is going to be something I have to paint around. That's why I'm asking myself. I think I'm actually going to work on the form a little bit first. See, I move that arm, and there's this cool passage there. It's a little lighter than that. Now I want to come out of my clean terps on this. I was dipping into my dirty terps. So this is cleaning out the brush. I'm going to start my mix again. And now using my clean terp, the point of using the terp is just to get the paint to the consistency I want. I'm going to add a little bit of that blue cerulean hue. Maybe a little of that, which is the cobalt. And let's take a look. That's a little intense. So let's take a little more of a gray, blue. And what I'm doing here is just trying to show that this part of her, above her elbow, is heading towards the sky. There's actually a harder edge here. And then let's look at that collar up here. It sort of blends a little bit there. And this is all done with a light touch, dry brush. I'm overstating the chunkiness of this because when I put the pattern on, I think that we're going to lose some of that form. And having a little more of the defined chunk quality will help us see the form underneath the pattern. And I'm just looking at what folds overlap what folds here. All right, so now let's look at this stitching. Now this will be impressionistic, but I'm still going to follow the thinking of if the stitching is in the light, it's going to be a little lighter and it's going to be a little warmer than the stitching that is in the shadow mass. As long as I follow that at this break, this is my shadow. Any of the stitching that appears in the light is going to be lighter and it's going to be warmer. Any of that stitching that appears in the shadow is going to be a little darker and a little cooler. That is far more important than how accurately I actually paint those shapes, because the stitching could have been anything. But if I can bend it into the cool and bend it into the light, the stitching will look like it is on the cloth and wraps around her elbow. I think I'll just sort of use shapes. I'm not going to try to do each little bit of stitch. I'm just going to sort of do the shapes and then maybe I'll cut in a little bit to suggest that there's some variation in the stitching. So to do this, let's see. Let's just start with a mix of alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, and a little green. And that's just because rather than use the black is very opaque. This is going to be more transparent. Now, I can see where I am, add a little white, and that's kind of a blue, gray, dark. And that might work on that side. And then let's see, let's go ahead and warm it up. Now this is adding some opacity to it because ochre is opaque. So when I look at that, I think I want it to be a little redder. More red, more orange. And then we'll play with this. Now this is going to go on fairly thin and it probably may look a little sloppy at first. That's okay. I'm going to go lighter. I'm going to actually exaggerate the lighter value in the lights. And I think this is what Sorolla would do as well. When you look at how he brings darks around into the light, he really makes it clear that that dark belongs in the light. That's why I use light and shadow, because the dark that's in the light is a light dark. The dark that's in the shadow is a shadow or cool dark. I hope that made sense. And it's okay just to be gestural. That's enough for now. Let's go to the cool or shadow side. And you can see how I'm pulling the brush in a certain direction to kind of indicate or describe the shape or the planes that the shape is on. Now there's a difference between this warm dark and this cool dark. I might want to lighten this a little more after seeing it. Look, a little chevron there. See how I roll the brush there? Now, that's the shadow line, so when I come onto this side, what am I going to use? I'm going to use the warm dark here. I'm hoping that the camera's picking that up. Because if it isn't, then you just have to trust me. I'll probably lighten that as well. Now I'm going back, I'm cleaning my brush. I'm going back into my shadows, which for the most part and again, this is bravura brushwork, meaning I just want to put it down and take what I get and not push things around too much. Here this actually gets a little darker and it's distorted. The shape is distorted by the fold. Now it is darker because it's in a dark within the shadow shape. And if I were to really paint to the next level down, I would distinguish between this part of that stitching and that part in terms of value. I think for the purposes of what we're doing here, I'm not going to. And this again, I'll be sort of refining later at some point. Down here we have just a little bit of that pattern reappearing. Light touch, because I want it to be a little different. And then we'll pull this down a little more, and I'm going to bring in, let's see, so this is that. I see what I got going here. Let's just play around with this a little more. The drawing is not terribly accurate, but I'm going to accept it. Now, the question is, did I convince you? And as the painting progresses, I will revisit that area and work it more so that it is in keeping with the rest of the painting. I'll lighten this up here. That helped a lot. So, by the way, I haven't gotten to the point where I get to have fun with real free brush strokes. I'm still playing around with the setup.
The art of Spanish master Joaquin Sorolla changed the world. His paintings, for the first time in history, showed that a painter could create the feel of dramatic warm sunlight on human flesh. His paintings create such a feeling of sunlight that viewers may find themselves squinting when they look at his work, as though the bright sun were in their eyes. Claude Monet was so taken with Sorolla's work that he called him the Master of Light. Sorolla is widely regarded as one of the most brilliant plein air painters ever and one of the great painters of all time. His paintings not only convey the feeling of light, they're packed with human emotion, with the stories of the people he painted. For over 100 years, painters have tried to copy his style and create his feeling in their own paintings, yet few have succeeded. One painter, Thomas Jefferson Kitts, has spent countless hours studying Sorolla's work to understand the techniques he used to create the feeling of light and emotion. And after an exhausting effort, Kitts has documented what he has learned from Sorolla. Kitts is both inspired and exhilarated by the way light plays across the landscape. In fact, he's devoted most of his life to capturing this in his paintings. There's no doubt that this is a leading factor in his being widely regarded as one of today's best painters. Now, Kitts guides you through his in-depth discoveries, where he shows you how to paint the color and intensity of light. You'll discover the working methods and incredible techniques of Sorolla, the way Sorolla applied the paint to produce such a stunning end result, how Sorolla conveyed the intensity of light in his paintings, and what he did to make the light stand out, and much more.
So if you think about it, I'm going to put that right next to each other. Same value, but this is cooler. And that's what I want to put, I think, right in here.
The ability to paint the color of light is a skill that separates average painters from great ones. And now you can paint along, step by step, while this skill is explained in an easy-to-digest method that even beginning painters can grasp. Sorolla, Painting the Color of Light with Thomas Jefferson Kitts, is now available on DVD or streaming video.
Well, that is Sorolla with Thomas Jefferson Kitts. He goes through the entire process Sorolla goes through in the full-length video, which you can find at lilyartvideo.com. Remember, we have a special discount code in the comments section. Just go there to get it for today's discount. All right, let's get right to our interview with Thomas Jefferson Kitts. Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Plein magazine. Today I'm honored to be with Thomas Jefferson Kitts. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I'm really curious because the name Thomas Jefferson Kitts, did you get a hard time with that when you were a kid?
Yeah, actually I did,
Yeah.
which is why I stopped using it when I was a kid. But until I was in first grade, I used Jefferson, or I used Jeff. But when I went to school, I changed to Tom.
And so the parents, what was the reasoning behind the name?
Well, it goes back generations. I'm actually the 9th in the line of that name. So I'm Thomas Jefferson Kitts, the 9th, but I don't lead with that, Eric.
And what about your kid?
Oh, wow, we broke it.
You broke it?
Yeah.
9
yeah.
generations and you're the one that broke it.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, we were just going to have the one boy, and my wife, rightly so, wanted to have some naming rights there. So he's got part of that, but not all of that.
So tell me about this journey that you've taken as an artist. How did you first find that you were interested in art?
Well, that's always been the case, to be honest.
I'd rather you were not honest, actually.
Oh, really? You wanted to make something up?
Yeah, make something up.
It
Make something up that sounds really good.
It wouldn't be as good as the truth. I mean, this is a little Norman Rockwell, but when I was really young, I used to visit my grandmother, who was a folk artist. And she always had some project waiting for me anytime the family visited. So the first thing I would do is jump out of the car, run into her house, and there on the kitchen table would be something laid out for me to do. And this is before I remember.
What kind of projects?
Oh gosh, anything from craft projects like making nativity scenes out of thread spools and felt and Christmas related or Halloween related sort of stuff to drawing and painting things. But what fascinated me about her as a folk artist, not that I knew what that was at that point, was that she did these watercolor stories of the animals that lived in the pond and near the pond where she lived. And I just would page through the new work every time I visited, and I was always thinking, that's what I want to do, something like that.
Wow, so you caught the bug very early.
I did.
Now, did your grandmother ever know that you became an artist?
Yes. Yes, actually. Let's see, she passed when I was 19, and by that time it was clear what I was going to do. And I just give her cred for all of that.
So what was the path that you took? You obviously got the bug there with your grandmother, and then what did you do about it? Did you study art in high school, college?
Yes, and younger. My parents recognized the proclivity I had for doing this because I would spend hours at home just kind of drawing and painting and cartooning, whatever the kids do at that time. And they put me into a Saturday academy. They were really big on education. So for a long period of time, I was going to college, basically going to what was then called the Oregon Museum Art School on Saturdays and doing things that I loved, just loved.
Now, what age you were at that time?
Oh, I'd say somewhere 8 to 12, 13. It was intermittent in the sense that it would go for a term, then not, and then go back and forth.
So were these things that were designed for kids your age, or were they designed for older people?
For kids. Yeah, this was a classroom of kids. Kids similarly inclined. There was one project that I remember most because it was the most frustrating thing that I'd experienced at that point. Remember, this was the early 70s, so I show up one day in class on a Saturday, and there's a box in the middle of the room, and there's a lot of noises coming from that box, and I walk over and I look in, and there's about 3 or 4 Dalmatian puppies in that box. Now, of course, every kid's like going, wow, this is so cool. And these puppies are squirming and running around, and the instructor said, okay, draw those puppies.
Oh, that sounds a little difficult.
It really was, because kids, myself included at that age, are very concrete. If you're told to draw a puppy, you want to draw the puppy, but they wouldn't stop moving. So I actually had a bit of a hissy fit, and I threw down my drawing tool, it must have been a pencil, and stomped out of the room. I remember doing that, just so frustrated that I couldn't get these puppies to stop moving. And the instructor kind of gently followed me out and kind of cajoled and soothed me and brought me back in, got me back drawing again, and so I drew the best I could like everybody else. And then, when I was settled down, he said, everybody, great, let's get the puppies out of the room and let's look at your drawings. Neat, this is really good stuff. Now here's what I want you to do. And then he gets out scissors and he wants us to cut up our drawings of these puppies. and paste them onto cubes in some sort of interesting design. That was my second hissy fit, because I had to draw these puppies, and now he wants me to cut up my drawing. I just didn't understand. But I did as I was told, and that's the kind of instruction I had at that time in my life.
So I have to ask, did he finally reveal what the point of all of that was?
Yeah, he did, but I don't remember what it was.
So you're not asking your students to draw puppies?
No. Well, I would ask them. I would draw puppies with them, and I just wouldn't have them cut up the drawing.
Right.
I think that, okay, I'm going to jump ahead. Actually, in my life now, I don't invest a lot in the actual work anymore. I could cut up a painting and be okay with it. But back then, not the drawing.
Well, I think that's probably an important distinction for people to understand. So if somebody's trying to learn to paint, one of the things that is a very difficult lesson is getting invested in your work. You lay something down, you paint on it for a while, you fall in love with it, and even then when you realize the drawing is wrong, something's off, you kind of either have to destroy it or change it or start over.
Yes.
And that's a very difficult thing to do as a painter.
It's a watershed moment, honestly. One that I experienced, and one that I usually try to get my students to experience, is that you have to both be invested in the outcome, but not overly so. You have to be willing to, as I call it, open up the painting again so that you can make these changes and corrections as you're working. And if you can't do that, then you're trapped by the series of unfortunate decisions you might have made to that point. There is a point, however, that when you paint enough, it stops being a problem, and you realize, hey, this is just a painting.
But you also, if you paint enough, you probably get to the point where you're not making the same kind of mistakes as frequently.
I wish.
You wish. Okay. Yeah, I wonder if there's a way to help students overcome that. I had an instructor one time that he would come in and he'd see what you're working on, and if it was wrong, he'd bring a palette knife in and just start scraping down everything. And I watched somebody go insane at that moment in time.
You know, I think we had the same teacher, maybe two different places, two different people, but yes. In my very formative period of painting, when I was still an undergrad, I had an instructor who would come up to you, and this would be a painting you've been working on for 3 to 18 hours over a course of maybe a week or 2 weeks from life. And you're thinking, yeah, I'm getting this down. And he would come up and look at it and say, and then he would pick up one of your brushes and proceed to basically correct what was out or wrong or not working in your painting. The first time he did that to me, I had that feeling of rage, like, hey, I got this far, what are you doing? That's mine. And
kind of like the puppy moment when you stormed out of the room.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing a pattern here.
There is, yeah, there is. But even before he put down that brush, I thought, oh, that's a good way to learn. He's showing me, not with words, he's showing me with actually doing it. I won't do that again because I see how he fixed it.
Right.
And the other thing I learned, which is again very important, is that once you paint a part of a painting, and you may fall in love with that, if you have to scrape it because you have to move the elbow over or take the boulder in the mountain and push it to the left, it is not going to take the same amount of time to do it the second time. You're going to do it in far less time.
Right, because you've done the whole thing, you've practiced.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah. So you you went through high school, you went into college. Did you go to a specialty school for design?
I did, actually. I actually started off at a state school. It was a good school. I started off as a pre-journalist major because at that point in time I thought I would become a political cartoonist and work for a paper. And then I ran into the 8 a.m. microeconomics class, and I have to tell you, numbers have never been my thing, especially at that morning. So I switched over to the art department in the state school and immediately saw, this is not about me, but I saw that I was really the best person in this department, and I hadn't any real formal training.
And why do you think you were the best? Because you'd just been drawing so much?
Yes, that's a large part of it. Drawing is everything.
Right.
But what that told me is that it's not good enough to be the best there. I had to go find some place where I was mediocre at best. So I had something to rise to. And it's strange, but I understood that at that age. It took me a year. I dropped out. You know, parents like me call that the, you know, oh, that's my kid taking a gap year. No, I dropped out and waited a year so I could get back into a real art school, and that was in Kansas City, the Kansas City Art Institute, which both had a very good design illustration program and a tremendous painting department.
Well, I think Hallmark tapped a lot of their students and
Yes.
pulled them into Hallmark in
Yes.
Kansas City.
And they still do. It's my understanding they still do. In fact, I almost went to work for Hallmark after I graduated there, except they wanted me as a design coordinator, and I wanted to be one of the illustrators. I wanted to be on the board drawing and painting. Now, if I'd had my head about me, I would have gone in as a DC and then said, okay, hey, can I switch hats now and go draw and paint? But no, I just went home and got involved in other things.
So you pursued illustration?
I did. I actually ended up going back home, Portland, Oregon, got a job with a design firm as an art director, and then freelanced illustration using reps in LA and New York. I wanted to add somebody in Chicago, but at that time it was just too much.
Well, what kind of illustration were you doing?
I was doing a mixture of what we would have called editorial, book, and institutional. I didn't do a lot of advertising illustration because that would have been in conflict with the people I worked for, because I worked for essentially an agency.
And you were doing illustration for the agency as well?
Yeah, not that much though.
Oh, just you were an art director?
Yeah, but this is why they hired me. They hired me because I could draw. There might be a theme that keeps popping up here. And at that time, if you could draw, you could do your comping, you could come up with your ideas, you could actually have more ownership, and they valued you because you had this skilled, you could basically draw the picture the client had to see before you made it, which is a very expensive process, as you know. So I would sit there and I would like use my skills to like draw the dashboard of a Mercedes-Benz that needs to have a certain radio in it out of my head. Not my funnest subject matter, but I could do it. And that actually pushed me very quickly up through the ranks of the agency I worked for. I eventually was the creative director by the time I left, some 7 years after that. And I don't know, it was good because I could draw.
A lot of the great painters, a lot of the great Western painters, the ones doing the characters, the cowboys and
Yeah.
the Native Americans and the horses and so on, they all came out of illustration.
They did.
So how did illustration then lead you into fine art?
That is a fantastic question. Because at this point in my life, in my early to mid-20s, I was living 3 lives. I was an art director that was working in a cubicle in a firm. I was freelancing illustration, and I was going out plein air painting. Because my last year at Kansas City Arts Institute, I went over to the painting department to just paint. I'd run out of courses I could take in the commercial end, but I needed these studio hours to finish up with a BFA. So I spent that whole senior year as a painter, and that's where I really understood what I wanted to do. So I come home, get a job, day job, and I'm doing what I just mentioned there, but I'm also painting. And all I can say is between the 3, day job as an art director, freelancing illustration, going out and painting whenever I had a chance, I didn't sleep much.
Well, sleep's overrated.
Yeah.
So you learned plein air painting at the Kansas City Institute?
No, that's again a very good, that's an insightful question. At that time, at that school, we learned, it was almost an atelier approach. Everything had to be observationally based, but we worked in the studio from the figure or from still lifes. There was no going outside as a class. In fact, the first time I even thought of doing this was when I left the school. There was some students that had come in and done this on their own, and it looked like they were having so much fun. And of course, they were not crazy about their work, and I wasn't that impressed with it either, but they had so much fun. I thought, when I'm done and I'm home, I'm going to give this a try. And so about a week after I got home, I went to the art store. I picked up a cheap Italian easel, aluminum folding thing, and I bought a 24 by 36 inch canvas. Yeah, because that's the size you were working on in the studio. And I proceeded to drive up to the backside of a mountain near my house after work. This was summertime, and looked back at a mountain, Mount Hood, maybe 60 miles away, and I proceeded to spend all summer trying to paint every tree, every branch, every needle, every little window between here and there. It took me 3 months
On that one painting?
on that one painting.
Yeah, and what did you learn from that?
Don't do that.
Yeah. So with that in mind, when somebody's first learning plein air painting, usually they've painted already in the studio, but not always. But what's the best advice for somebody who's first going out plein air painting?
First, believe that you can do this, because really anyone can. It's just a question of focusing. But I would recommend what I hear often other people say, which is start small.
Meaning a small canvas.
Yeah, start small, both metaphorically and literally, but small, 8 by 10, 9 by 12. I wouldn't recommend going higher than 11 by 14 because you're trying to attend to a lot of space in a small area. That's one. I would go out with a minimum of equipment, maybe 2 or 3 brushes. They don't have to be a big, broad range. I would go out with a minimum of palette of colors, 3 to 6, and find a friend. This is actually one of those kind of art things that allow you to socialize and offer support and receive support as you do this. I didn't have any of that. When I left school, there was nobody in my area that did it. We didn't even know what to call it. I didn't know what to call it. I just said, I'm going outside to paint. And I might call my friends up and try to cajole them into, you want to go outside and paint? And they would go, really? Why would you want to do that?
Right.
So the first 9 years, there was nobody. And I had to go out and make every mistake like that big canvas possible. Bottom line, to get back to what I would say is start small, fewer paint colors, keep it simple. And that's the sort of thing I teach, honestly, when I work with the young beginners.
I might even add to that, if I might.
Sure.
Not that I'm the one being interviewed here.
Hey.
But, I've been thinking a lot about this process because, my goal is to teach 1 million people to paint, and I want to get more people going outdoors and painting.
You are well on your way, sir.
Well, I've got a good start.
Yeah.
But I think, if you're first off, I think somebody should learn to paint before they go outside and paint.
It's helpful.
Yeah, then you're not trying to figure out how to mix colors and use all the materials and everything.
Yeah.
So learn to paint inside.
Could
right?
I just comment on that?
Yes.
Because the quick comment is that most of the landscape painters that I admire that are deceased and alive today, they learn to paint, as you say, first. Most of them learn to paint from still lifes.
Yeah.
Because things don't move.
Yeah.
And then they take that skill outdoors. So
I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So you learn to paint not from photographs, but from a life. Start simple, a simple object, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
then go out on your back porch if you have one, or your backyard, sit in a lawn chair, get a table, and replicate what you do in the house. But because you're out there, you're going to get the overwhelming experience of all the light and the moving trees and all the stuff that's changing all the time, the clouds in front of the sun. Before you even venture out, to a beautiful place, just paint the tree in the backyard.
Great advice, actually. Very much, yes. That's not the one I took myself.
No, of course not. But I think we've got to get baby steps for people.
Yeah.
So you have become very prominent in the world of plein air painters.
Thank you.
I think that's a compliment.
Well, that's good. Always a question. Always an open question. Yes.
But tell the folks that are watching this the value of plein air painting. Why plein air painting is different than studio painting?
Wow. I'm pausing because I want to see how to frame that. I think plein air painting is just by extension the same thing as observational painting, meaning I want to see what I'm looking at the same time what I'm painting with as little as possible in between. I started plein air painting at that time of my life because I couldn't afford to pay a model, what I would have to, and I'd sort of lost interest in the still life. So it was a challenge. That's why I started. But when I went out under God's own light, let's say, and I started to see things that I never saw before because I stood there long enough to see them. And I'd look at this, I'd look at that, I'd look at this, I'd look at this. It allowed me to see the subtleties that I was not seeing even when I was in school, in studio. And it also allowed me eventually to sort of anticipate when, if I'm in the studio, I'm not getting good color sense. Or if I'm working as an illustrator and I'm working from photographs that I had shot for a particular job, when was the camera lying to me? And more importantly, how could I fix it? So I think aside from just the joy of being outside in real light, seeing the real world, and learning to translate that to the canvas, you do build up almost a data bank in your head that you can take indoors when you have to. And it takes time, takes effort, but it's very rewarding when you can sit there and work indoors and create a thing that looks like it was done outdoors, if you have to.
So why not just paint from photographs?
Great question.
You said that photographs lie. Tell us about that.
Okay, to put it very succinctly, the value relationships in a photograph are often deceptive, meaning that they can be more contrasty, more light and more dark. You can lose information that you need in the shadows if they block up, they become sort of contrasty. Or on the other end, on the high end, like the highlights where the brights are, you can lose information. And sometimes there might be a turn of a rock or a turn of a face, if your figure's outdoors, that's so subtle that where that turn happens is lost. Now, if you have a lot of, in the face concept, if you have the anatomical knowledge of knowing where that cheekbone is, you can sort of insert that with your intellect. But that isn't the same thing as actually seeing it. The other thing that happens in a photograph is, like the light and dark contrast gain, you often lose sort of temperature shifts that are very subtle. Like, did this part of the tree go cool green or did it go warm green? I can't tell because it's a photograph.
I got to stop you there.
All right.
I just got to stop you because there's somebody who's sitting here watching this, because I was one of those people. And you're throwing out terms that I don't understand.
Yeah,
so
my apologies.
No, don't be apologetic, but help us understand it. So if I'm somebody watching this and you're talking about a warm green and a cool green, I'm like, what the heck is he talking about?
Well, this is not meant to be a shameless plug for one of my videos, but one of the videos I've recently produced really goes into great length. What do I mean by warm and cool color temperatures? I'm going to back it out and come at it from, say, Richard Schmid's point of view. It's about the temperature of light. The light source outdoors on a sunny day is almost always from the sun going to be warmer than, say, if you look into the shadows out there outside. The shadows will generally be biased towards a blue because the light that fills the shadow is coming from the sky. So now you have a warm primary light and you have a cool fill into the shadow. Now, if it was that simple, we could stop there.
Yeah.
But if you get that far, then you go outside and you see it. Then you start looking in the shadows and you find out within the cool shadows, there are some relatively different temperature changes. Maybe that shadow is more blue there, but over there it's a little more red, or maybe a little more green. That's what I'm talking about. Let me see if I can say it simply. The temperature of the light that hits the object, tree, barn, person, rock, mountain, the temperature of that light modifies the local temperature of that object.
Oh, wait, there's another one of those words.
Local color? Okay. And that's, again, maybe I'm making this too complex.
No, well, maybe.
I've reached a point where I can look around me, right behind you, I can look at your face, and I can see how the temperature changes the color, the local color of your face. Yes, you have this sort of flesh color here, and it varies because somewhere the blood comes up and somewhere there's more bone showing and there's more areas where the sun's maybe sort of hit it differently. That's local changes to your face. But I can also see how the light on this side of your face is pushing the color of your skin towards, let's say, the cool, the pink, whereas there's another light just off your shoulder that's a really warm yellow light that's giving me some yellow highlights here. And then I see the bounce coming off here, which is off a wall, which is filling that shadow and giving me yet another temperature. Now, this has nothing to do with value, light and dark, grays in between. It has everything to do that once there is a change in value, there's also a change in hue.
Okay, so lots of big words.
Yeah, sure.
Lots of big words.
Sure.
And our audience, a lot of our audience know these things. And so for those of you who know these things, just understand that at one point in time you were trying to learn them. So for the people watching this, okay, local color means what?
It means the color of the object in neutral light.
Neutral light.
Yes.
Not dark light, not darkness.
Not warm light, not cool light.
Okay, so give me an example of what that might be.
Okay. Again, let's just take a tree standing out underneath the sun. And this is if it's a sunny day. Because if it's not a sunny day, it's different.
Okay, let's
So,
use a tree
just
in the
the
sunny
sunny
day.
day. So here's the sun, and it's shining on the tree. And where the sun hits the tree, it is lighter in value, but it's also taking the inherent local green of that tree, and it pushes that green towards the yellow because it's a warm light hitting the green, and it pushes that green towards the yellow.
Okay, so let me just stop you there for
Sure.
just a second. I'm going to take a leaf off of the tree, and I'm going to lay that leaf down in the shadow, and that leaf is going to be darker.
It will be darker in
and
value.
bluer.
And bluer, yes.
If I take that leaf into what you would refer to as neutral light, not a lot of sunlight, just kind of average light, that's going to look like a green leaf to me.
Yeah, that'll look like the local green.
Right. But if I lay that I'll lay it on the grass where the sun is shining, that leaf is going to go yellow.
Yes.
Okay, so it's that middle tone, that neutral tone, that is local color.
Yeah,
Essentially.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word tone myself, but I would. You've got the idea.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Tone
cool.
may indicate value or something. I get that.
Yeah.
So, all right. So that's one of those buzzwords you used.
Yeah.
Now the other one you used is hue.
Yes.
That I have an uncle Hugh.
Do you?
Yeah.
Spelled a little different.
Yeah, I think so. H-U-E.
Yes.
All right. So explain that to folks.
I'll do this as simply as I can because it's not rocket science. It really is something that I struggled with until I went to school, and then somebody explained it to me, and I thought, wow, I can see more differentiations in color than ever before I understood this. But any color you're trying to see or mix in paint, it consists of three characteristics. So a color is not just one thing. It's three things combined. It is a hue. In this case, is it a yellow? That's where it is on the color wheel. Is it a red? That's where it is on the color wheel. Is it a green? That's where it is on the color wheel.
So the color is the hue.
No. The color is like this, and that's where I'm going with this. So the hue is the color on the wheel, but every hue has a gray equivalent value. A yellow is a light gray. A purple, if it's a full purple, is a dark, almost black value. And then that third thing, and I'm going to run through this one more time so that now you get the overview. The third thing is the intensity. You can have a light yellow that is high intensity or highly saturated, or you could have a light yellow that is weak. It's not strong at all.
So intensity, is that the same as chroma?
Yes.
Okay.
Now it's funny you would say that because most of the time when I say the word chroma, people like go, huh? So I've learned to use saturation or intensity, but I learned it as hue, value, chroma.
So you've talked a lot about values. For the person who might not know this, the values are the value scale, meaning dark to light,
Yes.
right? Assuming that there's black is the darkest value, white is the brightest value,
Yes.
and then there are gradations in between.
Yeah, it's sort of a continuous, in truth, it's a continuous from absolute black to as absolute white, and everything in between falls on a sort of continuous line from light to dark.
And of course, you never find pure black or pure white in nature.
Well, that's where we're going to get to, because that's where we get to the temperature thing.
Right.
Okay, you're with this now. Okay, so
I do this for a living.
I know, I know. Let's see if I want to get this right back on track. I don't want to over-explain this because people make this way more complicated than it is. But if you have a warm light source that is pushing what it illuminates, the tree, towards a yellow-green, on the opposite side in the shade area, you've got the same green with less light, but some of that light is blue from the sky. What happens to the green? It gets pushed towards the blue. Now, what's amazing is that if you put the cool green next to the yellow warm green, there's a vibration that occurs. And now we're talking about impressionism. You can get the value light and the value dark spot on, and you could make it a monochromatic green. Doesn't change its hue at all. Doesn't go to the warm or cool. It's the same green, just a light green and a dark green. You don't get this. But if you take the green, push it to the warm, because that's what sun's doing, and you take the green in the shadow and push it towards the blue-green, which is what the sky's doing, when they come together, the magic happens.
Now, there's also a theory about a center line, or some people used to call it the bedbug line.
Right, I love that term.
Which is oftentimes when you're transitioning from light to dark, or from light to shadow.
Yeah.
There's a middle tone in between there, which supposedly has the most vibration, which is oftentimes a high chroma color. Now of course, there are lots of theories on that.
I know where you're going with that, and this is one of the things where I say most of the time yes, sometimes not.
Well, there are no rules that apply all the time.
Yeah, the only rule that I apply is can I see it?
Right.
And that's why I paint from life as much as possible. So what you're describing, the bedbug line, which I've always wondered where that term comes from. It's very charming. I call it the core shadow, meaning that's that area on a rounded object, no matter what shape it is. If it's got a rounded kind of form to it, it's not a sharp turn like a box. If it's rounded, there's a point where there's light on one side, and then it falls off, and then there's possibly light coming from the other side. And in between those two, the light and the shadow side, is that core shadow.
Which is typically local color.
Which is local color. That
Right.
You got there before I did.
See, you guys, you know how this is all coming together now.
Yeah. Now, there can be debates, and I think they're all valid. Is that local color, does it appear cooler or warmer than the light side or the cool side? And actually, you find it sometimes either or. It depends. But the concept here is that that core shadow will only appear between the light mass and the shadow mass. Core shadow does not appear in a shadow mass. It's always on the border, the meridian between the two.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah, that was kind of,
Yeah.
I don't know if that was all you wanted though.
So I'd like to know some of the artists throughout history that really inspired you, and what was it that gave you that inspiration?
Oh my, how much time do you have?
Let's start with one.
No, I have to give you three.
All
I have to give you what I call the holy trinity of painters for
All
me.
right. I think I can guess who they are.
I bet you can.
All right.
Go
Let's
ahead.
See. Sargent, Sorolla, and Zorn.
Bingo, right there. Nailed it. Sargent, Sorolla, and Zorn. And not necessarily in that order, but to me, that's what got me into this business when I started looking at their work. There was just something, especially Sargent, because he was the first person I bumped into back in the mid-'80s when I just finished up with school. I looked at his landscapes, not so much the portraiture, which are amazing, but the landscapes he was doing. I thought, wow, I want to do that. I have no idea how to do that, but that's what I want to do. And I chased Sargent like a demon for the next 20 years. Didn't know how. There wasn't a lot of information of how he worked. I was very sort of method and technology and technique oriented at that point, thinking, if only I could find a book that told me how to do this, then I could do it too, kind of thinking, which I'm not that way anymore. But at that time, I was looking and I couldn't find anything. And I think it's because Sergeant A didn't teach all that much. And only when he did, he taught only the basics. We actually have him in writing saying that I'm only going to teach you the basics. If there's anybody who would teach you advanced painting, it would have been Sargent, but he just wouldn't do that because he didn't want that to interfere with his students' development. He didn't want to teach people how to be Sargent.
Right.
Anyway, to move on. So, maybe 25 years later, I come across Sorolla, which just blew my mind, because this is about the time I started to understand the temperature thing that we were just talking about and starting to see it.
Oh, and he was the king of temperature.
Yes.
I mean, he could make the flesh glow.
Yes, yes. You know, when you look at his paintings, even when I see them in reproduction in a book, one of my first impulses when I look at a new work is to go like this, which is not, you know, I'm not saying, oh, I wish I couldn't see that. It's like I'm trying to shield my eyes from the light. And when you see a real painting that's like this big, like at the Hispanic Society in 18, well, there's what, 18 by 240 18 by 240 feet of paintings by him. You walk in that room and it's like you just, my reflex is to kind of just, there's too much light coming at me.
Right, right.
That's not really what's happening, but that's my impulse.
Right.
I was stunned by that. And then I started to connect the temperature thing with the value thing that he was doing. And that has been sort of what I pursue, or have been pursuing for the past, I don't know, 3-4 years.
Is there any documentation on Sorolla's teaching?
I haven't found much, but I have a couple of books that are in Spanish that I can't read. It's worth learning to read Spanish, I think, to read this book.
Or put it on Google Translate.
I did that.
Oh,
I
you
did that. And I don't know, you know, from my own attempts to teach and write, verbiage is important, as you know.
Yeah.
What I would like to do is find somebody who understands painting well enough and Spanish well enough that could spend time with me to go through these books to see if what there is that might be on this process.
I'm sure you'll hear from somebody after they watch this. So.
Bring it on.
Yeah.
Bring
Okay,
it on.
now talk about Zorn.
Well, Zorn came to me after the first two, and I guess what really has amazed me from the get-go is the brushwork I see in the artists that I like. That they just sort of effortlessly seem to put this paint down, and the paint sort of describes the thing that they're painting without a lot of labor or work. Now, I'm sure there was labor and work and failed attempts and run-ups and redos, but when you look at the work, it just, you don't see it. You know, that's all gone. And Zorn has always struck me as amazing in that respect. Mm-hmm. And I also, sorry?
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, all three of these painters were contemporaries, as well as Boldini, Fortuna, and any other number of painters which have not been elevated or sort of reintroduced to our history yet, but they're well on their way.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because you mentioned that. I was talking the other day to John Singer Sargent's grandnephew, Richard
yes.
Ormond.
Richard, yes.
And he was talking about when he was a 17-year-old child. He's elderly now, but when he was 17, Sargent was so out of favor that you could pick him up for $100. They just were not popular at all. So there's a possibility of undiscovered others who will be discovered, who will change.
Yes, actually, yes. By the time of Sargent's death, he'd sort of been considered passé, that he was too sort of, I guess, decorative. There was a word for it. I think it was called Sargentolatry. So if you tried to paint like him, you were considered facetious. And facile is the word I really wanted there. Even though, and actually in his lifetime, he was accused of being little more than a camera, which blows my mind because when we look at his work from our vantage point today, in my mind, he made all these amazing changes and revisions and alterations to what he was actually painting that meant he wasn't a camera. Mm. He was making these aesthetic decisions that, I don't know, maybe people just stopped being interested in. Mm-hmm. I wish I could have picked up a few of his paintings at that point.
Well, you're just going to make so much money that you'll just be able to buy originals at full price. So.
Well, that would be lovely, but as you know, I will always say yes to money. It's not my primary pursuit.
Of course, of course.
Yeah.
And how about Mancini? Are you familiar with his work?
Yes, that's the other guy I was going to throw in there. Now, Boldini, Fortuna, and Mancini, when you throw them all together, they're sort of like the Holy Trinity, but taken to like another level of detail or flourish. And there are times all three of those seem a bit confetti to me, but I'm still amazed at the virtuosity that they display. It's kind of like, oh, I'm going to show off here just because I can. And I'm going, yes, you can. Mm-hmm. I learned from that stuff.
Yeah, Mancini was literally insane.
He was?
He was, and it really comes across in his work. What's fascinating to me is you look at a portrait that he does, and every part of that portrait is just filled with detail and bric-a-brac and big brush strokes and thick paint.
Yes.
And then you get to the face, and there's this beautifully constructed face that's just perfect. but he's got all this crazy busyness around him.
Yeah. I think the common tie to everyone we've talked to here is that the physicality of the paint comes to the forefront. Yes, there's a subject. Yes, there's an aesthetic. Yes, there's skill. But the fact that you look at these surfaces like, well, let's talk about Fechin, Nikolai Fechin. You know, there's nothing I like to do more than go up to a Nikolai Fechin like this and just get as close as I possibly can. And I have been tossed out of museums for doing that because I wouldn't get back far enough. There's just something about that surface, that riot of color that these artists put down, and yet when you step back, it all comes together and becomes real.
So you've got 3-4 masters that you've tried to learn from, study from, and obviously for someone watching this, one of the best things to do is to go to the museum and look at artwork.
Absolutely.
And try to figure out how they did it. But if you had dinner with one of those people who came back just for 12 hours, what's the burning question?
Well, I think most people would ask, how did you do it? I think I would simply ask, can I watch you do it? Can I see you do this voodoo that you do so well?
Yeah.
Because that's how I learn. Some of the best workshops I've ever taken, there's not been a lot of conversation between me and the teacher as much as, okay, I took the painting this far, what should I do now? Here's the brush. Show me, please. I would just love to watch.
Well, that's one of the reasons I do this. I was talking to Richard Ormond the other day, and we were talking about whether Sargent paints fast or slow. It looks like he paints fast, but Schmid looks like he paints fast, and he paints slow. And I said, wouldn't it be wonderful to have video of him? It's the reason I do these things is because guys like you will be dead someday, and people.
I'm not rushing into it.
Yeah, don't rush into it. But this is a really wonderful ability to be able to document that and to be able to get up and look at you, you know, when you're doing the little brush strokes and so on. So you have a thought on,
Yeah.
what is it?
Well, with Sargent, I read in his, not his memoirs, but a biography by a close family member who wrote that Sargent painted with deliberate haste, which I find an interesting combination of words. It's like he understood, like we'll get to Sorolla, that you needed to work quickly if you're trying to capture the effects of nature as they are moving, but there was a deliberate, controlled aspect to it, and I love that. Painting with deliberate haste. Now it's said of Sorolla, the other hero of mine, is that he painted at an incredible frenetic speed, and if you just look at the surfaces, you can see how fast he was moving, especially if you have any experience at all at trying to work quickly. And I think Richard Schmid said something to the effect of Sorolla painted like a pig eats, but oh, how he could eat.
Perfect.
Yeah, I hope I got that quote right. If I didn't, my apologies, Richard. I will do what I can to make it up. But the bottom line is, to me, I've taken that on as a credo, that speed is everything. But not to throw caution to the wind. There has to be some degree of control or everything flies apart. And that, to me, is the thrill. Bottom line, if we're trying to find something to end on here, when I go outside to paint, I want to be painting at Mach 5 and just sort of feel the contrail that's leaving behind me and just enjoy the view and not get in the way mentally of what's happening.
See, you're painting with instinct.
Yes.
And so, but for the early stage painter, and I learned this lesson from a fellow by the name of Fred Picker, who was a photographer that I studied under. And I had been frustrated that we weren't working on the art, we were working on the technology, you know, how to get the light right and so on. And he said, look, until you can do that stuff with your eyes closed, until you can do it to the point that it's nature, or that you can do it naturally, you have to think about those things. And I think if you paint enough and you take it slow and you learn properly, then you get to the point where these things become instinctual. You keep your palette so your colors are always in the same place.
Yeah.
You just get to the point where it's like playing the piano, you sit down and you know where the keyboard is.
Yes.
And then you start speeding it up and speeding it up and speeding it up, and then you get to the point where that instinct really kicks in, because the best paintings are the paintings with the instinct.
I think
At least
so.
I think so.
Yeah, I would totally agree.
Yeah.
To take your piano analogy a little bit further, Chopin developed his etudes not so much as standalone performance pieces, but as a way to train your hand to play his more difficult ones.
And etudes is the term the Russians use.
Maybe I got that mixed up. Maybe it's etudes. Okay. I think you're right.
No, well, it's the same.
Okay.
Yeah, etudes in music, but etudes are the same term that the Russians will use for a study. Instead of, we call it a plein air study, they call it an etude.
I like that.
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line is you want to work as fast as you can that you can control, but you want to just push yourself a little more, a little harder, a little faster. Enjoy it. Don't make your life hard. Enjoy it, but always reach a little further than you think you can grasp, because that's how you get better.
Do you paint as fast in the studio as you paint when you're outdoors?
Perfect question. I do have my outdoor speed and my indoor speed. Sometimes indoors I might say, okay, I'm getting impatient, I'm going to ramp it up and paint like I was outdoors. My outdoor speed is as fast as I can go, lickety-split. Indoor is, okay, I can take a break, I can think about this, I can come back to it, or I can just paint more sort of cautiously. So yeah, that's a really great question. In fact, I didn't even understand that indoor-outdoor speed thing until a mentor of mine said, Thomas, you have your indoor speed and you have your outdoor speed. It's just that sometimes I do bring the outdoor indoor.
Yeah, I get it. Well, this has been a pleasure. You know, we could probably talk for hours, and there's so much information. You're such a great teacher.
Oh, thank you.
So it's been a real pleasure having you. Thank you.
It's been great to be here and spending time with you as well.
Well, that is Thomas Jefferson Kitts from the video called Sorolla. You can get the full-length video and find out all about it at lilyartvideo.com, and you can put a discount to good use today if you find it in the comments section up there. Just go look for it in the comments section, all right? Well, thanks for watching today, and I want to remind you that we have 97 painting secrets from the world's best artists. It's a 2-hour video, and it's yours for free. Just go to 97tips.com. Hey, thanks for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes.
The art of Spanish master Joaquin Sorolla changed the world. His paintings, for the first time in history, showed that a painter could create the feel of dramatic warm sunlight on human flesh. His paintings create such a feeling of sunlight that viewers may find themselves squinting when they look at his work, as though the bright sun were in their eyes. Claude Monet was so taken with Sorolla's work that he called him the Master of Light. Sorolla is widely regarded as one of the most brilliant plein air painters ever and one of the great painters of all time. His paintings not only convey the feeling of light, they're packed with human emotion, with the stories of the people he painted. For over 100 years, painters have tried to copy his style and create his feeling in their own paintings, yet few have succeeded. One painter, Thomas Jefferson Kitts, has spent countless hours studying Sorolla's work to understand the techniques he used to create the feeling of light and emotion. And after an exhausting effort, Kitts has documented what he has learned from Sorolla. Kitts is both inspired and exhilarated by the way light plays across the landscape. In fact, he's devoted most of his life to capturing this in his paintings. There's no doubt that this is a leading factor in his being widely regarded as one of today's best painters. Now, Kitts guides you through his in-depth discoveries, where he shows you how to paint the color and intensity of light. you'll discover the working methods and incredible techniques of Sorolla. The way Sorolla applied the paint to produce such a stunning end result, how Sorolla conveyed the intensity of light in his paintings, and what he did to make the light stand out, and much more.
So if you think about it, I'm going to put that right next to each other. Same value, but this is cooler. And that's what I want to put, I think, right in here.
The ability to paint the color of light is a skill that separates average painters from great ones. And now you can paint along, step by step, while this skill is explained in an easy-to-digest method that even beginning painters can grasp. Sorolla, Painting the Color of Light with Thomas Jefferson Kitts, is now available on DVD or streaming video.